Hi everyone, and welcome to today's video, which is part of a series that I'm making on some of my favourite poems, and I'm going to be showing you in these videos how to make a start at analysing these poems, maybe in a slightly more complex way than you might have done when you were studying your GCSEs or when you were further down the school. So today we're going to be looking at Porphyrias Lover by Robert Browning, which may well be a poem that you're familiar with, especially if you've done love and relationships poetry for GCSE. And one of the reasons why I've chosen a poem that so many people know is because I'm going to show you how to apply literary theory to this poem. So I wanted to do something familiar because we're going to be applying unfamiliar concepts. So what is literary theory? Well, generally, when I'm teaching it, I look at three different types of theory, and these are lenses or perspectives that we can use when we're looking at literary texts that can really open our eyes to a whole range of interpretations and meanings in the text themselves. And I've done a separate series of videos on each of these literary theories. So if you're interested in them and you want to know more, search for Docky Smith and literary theory and you'll find some other videos to watch as well. So looking at Marxism first, Marxist literary critics explore how writers have represented the class system. So here we're thinking, and you can see in this little graphic, the working classes, so those people who live in relative poverty, who maybe do manual labour, who perhaps don't have very much education. And that would be the majority of the population, especially in the Victorian period, which we're thinking about with Robert Browning's poetry. Slightly above them we have the middle classes, so perhaps educated, doctors, solicitors, teachers and so on, librarians, a little bit more money, a little bit more affluent, perhaps are able to employ a servant in the Victorian period, and perhaps able to rent some better accommodation. And then at the top, again in the Victorian period, we might call this the aristocracy or the upper classes. If you've read An Inspector Calls, this would be Mrs. Burling and Gerald Croft, and they would be the people who exert the most power, and they own the means of production. So in An Inspector Calls, Mr. Burling owns the factory and Gerald Croft's family own the factory, so they control the production of products, of money, they control their employees as well. And the idea of control and using power is really central to Marxism. It's about how the upper classes control the other classes below them. And Marxists are often really interested in methods of rebellion, so how those oppressed workers struggle against their oppressors. And Marxist critics are also interested in looking at what the text reveals about the writer's own social and economic context. We could also look at poetry from a feminist perspective. And so I've put a little graphic here because in the Victorian period that we're looking at today, gender was very binary. So there was a concept of men, of masculinity. Men should exert power, they should be in control, they should dominate. Women should be subservient and submissive. And feminist literary critics look at the struggles women have in this context and how they're represented, explored, challenged or redressed in literature. So, for example, do women just quietly accept that men are in charge of their lives? Do they struggle against that? How is that struggle represented in the literature? And finally, we could look at post-colonial theory. I'm not going to apply this today to Porphyrias Lover, but you might just want to pause the video and have a read through that. And as I say, I've done other videos on literary theory as well, so you could watch that, my video on post-colonialism if you're interested in that. Okay, so the poem itself then. You might have read this before, but I'm just going to read it to you now. Porphyrias Lover by Robert Browning. The rain set early in the night, the sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite, and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened, with heart fit to break. When glided in Porphyria, straight she shut out the cold and the storm, and nailed and made the cheerless grate blaze up, and all the cottage warm, which done, she rose and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat and let the damp hair fall, and last she sat down by my side and called me. When no voice replied, she put my arm about her waist, and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and, stooping, made my cheek lie there, and spread over all her yellow hair. murmuring how she loved me, she, too weak for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free from pride, and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me forever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain. Sure, I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound, 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. No pain felt she. I am quite sure she felt no pain. As a shut bud that holds a bee, I warily oped her lids. Again laughed the blue eyes without a stain, and I untightened the next tress about her neck. Her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still, the smiling, rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all its scorn that once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyrias Love, she guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard, and thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. Okay, so in this poem we have a young lady who's left a feast, she's left a party at her mansion, she's walked across the family estate, and she's gone to visit one of the servants who lives on the estate and is employed by her family. And she goes in, and it's quite obvious from the start that they've been having a relationship, they've been having an affair. So she goes in, she lights the fire, she takes off her outer clothes, and she sits down and she starts to loosen her clothing a little bit. So she makes her smooth white shoulder bare. So for a Victorian audience, that would have been really shocking. You know, this is a woman who's really putting herself forward, and it's quite clear that her behaviour is sexually transgressive for the time. So she sits there, she snuggles up to her lover, and he doesn't reply to her. And the fact that she loves him, that she's here, that she's obsessed with him, makes her lover, makes the speaker of the poem convinced that he owns her, that she is his possession. And it's because of that realization that he then kills her. So he kills her so that he can keep her and he can control her and possess her. And so he murders her, and then they sit there on the sofa, the speaker with the dead body of Porphyria, and they just wait. And the end of the poem is really chilling, because this was a time when people were really questioning Christianity and religion and the existence of God. In this post-Darwinian setting, people had started to think, well, what if there is no God? And the end of the poem seems to prove that. The fact that God hasn't sent down any judgment or any punishment for this unprovoked murder convinces the speaker that God doesn't exist. So if we were going to make a Marxist interpretation of this poem, we're going to be looking at the class system and the struggle of the worker against the oppressor. And in this poem, the representative of the working class is the speaker of the poem. He's employed by a very wealthy family, and he's employed on their estate. And Porphyria, as a member of the upper classes, would be part of the oppressive class system that's trying to keep the working classes in their place. If we have a look here, you can see that the way Porphyria is described is really interesting. So she glided, she rose, she withdrew, she laid, she called, she displaced, and she was murmuring. So these words are very gentle, they're very soft, very elegant and sophisticated. And they reflect her upbringing in the upper classes and reflect that kind of level of kind of breeding, I suppose it would have been called at the time, or sophistication that she's gained through that very careful and upbringing in her education. And this juxtaposes quite starkly with the way that the speaker describes his setting. As well as that, if we look at what Porphyria is wearing, she's got a cloak and a shawl and gloves, and these items of clothing just hint at a certain kind of opulence and luxury in terms of her wardrobe. Her smooth white shoulder again is a hint that actually she doesn't engage in any physical work outside. You know, she's not tanned like a member of the working class who works on the farm might be. Her skin is very smooth, so she's not blemished by having to do any work during the day. And of course, tonight's gay feast suggests that her life is full of parties and opulence and fun, and there's not much in the world that would worry her. And in contrast, the speaker of the poem has got a cheerless grate. So his fireplace is completely empty. There's nothing in it. There's no fire. He doesn't have servants to make the fire for him, and he hasn't bothered to do it himself. He also lives in a cottage, which juxtaposes with the gay feast. So there's quite a difference between Porphyria and the speaker of the poem, and he really draws attention to that in the opening section. And then if we look further down here, so this section here means that Porphyria is too weak to leave this wealthy lifestyle behind, to cut her Wiener ties, so her ties to this opulent upper class world, and to give herself to the man in the working world. So I suppose what the speaker is reflecting here is the fact that the class system almost traps people within their classes, and that there's very little possibility that people are going to move from one class to the other, and that the attractions of wealth are enormous, and that those attractions overcome any kind of individual emotion or desire. So it's almost like the social system is stronger and more powerful than the individual desires. So if we look then at maybe a summary of this, we can see that what Browning does is he emphasises the stark difference between the social classes, exposing the inequality of Victorian society, which condemns many to live in poverty whilst others enjoy a luxurious lifestyle. And the speaker of the poem feels really bitter about this, and there's a detrimental impact of these class divisions on the individual and on individual relationships and emotions. So neither Porphyria nor her lover can really explore their relationship in a mature and open way because of the class boundaries that are in place there. And Porphyria's inability to leave her family for her lover demonstrates the hold that wealth and luxury have over the individual. And then the bitterness in the speaker that arises from this, his bitterness about Porphyria's reluctance to leave her family, reveals the discontent which arises from the unfair distribution of wealth and power. So if you delve into the poem from a Marxist perspective, you start to uncover all sorts of really interesting and nuanced ideas and details in the poem, which may not be immediately obvious if you just do a superficial reading, which is one of the real benefits of using literary theory as a lens or as a perspective to interpret a text through. And then just moving on here, so in his descriptions of the motivations for the murder, Browning reveals how the speaker's lack of power has led him to crave control and ownership over others. In addition to his potential madness, the class system has driven him to act on his desire for agency. So it's this desire for the kind of control that the upper classes have that leads the working class speaker to kill the upper class lover. Moving on to a feminist interpretation then, obviously the two genders are very clearly represented in them. And if we look at the way Porphyria acts, she is almost a stereotype of her gender. She conforms to the expectations of women in lots of ways. So it's her who lights the fire, her who improves the household setting. And of course, that would have been one of the responsibilities of a woman in a relationship. And if we look here, though, there's some hints that Porphyria's behaviour is a little bit transgressive. It's not quite fitting that stereotype that maybe she looked like she was going to fit at the start of the poem. It's her who sits down and then puts his face on her shoulder, his head on her shoulder. And that is her adopting quite a dominant position, and she's taking control of this situation, which would have been unusual for the time. If you've read Sonnet 29 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, you'll know the struggles that women had to go through in order to articulate their own passion and their own kind of emotions and their sexual desires towards men. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote that poem, Robert Browning was married to her, and so he reflects this idea in this poem as well. And then if we look here, we're back to this idea of the objectification of women. So the smooth white shoulder, her yellow hair, show that the speaker is thinking about Porphyria very much in terms of her physical body, rather than in terms of her intellectual power or her intelligence or anything like that. So in the first section of the poem, we oscillate between seeing Porphyria as a stereotypical woman and between seeing her as maybe being quite transgressive, quite dominant in the relationship. And then it's this point here that's really interesting for a feminist. So that moment, she was mind fair. The speaker, the male speaker, decides that he completely possesses, controls, owns his female lover, and that she is pure. So she's this kind of ideal of perfection. And the reason why he murders her is to exert that power over her and to completely own her, which is essentially what the patriarchy does, because in the patriarchal system, men want to control, dominate, own women. So if we were going to summarise what I've said there, then Browning's depiction of Porphyria as an elegant lady reflects gender stereotypes of the Victorian era. The male narrative voice dominates. Notice that Porphyria herself never speaks within the poem. Well, she does speak, but the speech isn't reported, so she is silenced within the poem. So the male narrative voice dominates, indicating the silencing of female opinions and perspectives within patriarchal societies. Yet, Porphyria's decision to leave her family and visit her lover reveals her frustration with such entrapping preconceptions of femininity. And the consequences of Porphyria's transgressive behaviour is her death. So then we could ask ourselves, is this a morality tale in which women are warned to adhere to traditional expectations? If you think of something like Jane Austen, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, there is a clear moral to the story. When Lydia runs off with Wickham, loses her virginity, disgraces the family, she's forced to marry him and so on. And there's a clear warning that that's not how you have a relationship. So is Browning's poem a similar morality tale? And it seems really unlikely to me, because as I've mentioned, Robert Browning was married to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Elizabeth Barrett's work is full of passion for the rights of women and for giving women a voice and independence and agency. And I really don't think that Robert Browning would have had such a close relationship with his wife, and at least not agreed with her a little bit on that. So alternatively, is Browning revealing that women who attempt to make free choices and take control will be quashed by patriarchal values? So Porphyria is murdered, after all, for her refusal to give herself forever to the male speaker. So is Browning pointing out what the consequences for women will be and saying, this is wrong, we need to change this, we need to change society? So I hope that those two perspectives on that poem has kind of opened your eyes to some of the possibilities that are raised by applying literary theory to texts. And what I would suggest now, as some further activities for you to do, is you could write up in an essay form one of these perspectives on Porphyrias Lover, or you could choose another similar poem, so for example, The Farmer's Bride by Charlotte Mew, and have a go yourself at applying a Marxist or a feminist lens to that.